Reconquista, Conquista, Inquisition, Armada, Franca. All this is the history of the country that occupies a large part of the Iberian Peninsula. We have already told you about some of the events of Spanish history, and now, in response to your numerous requests, we will briefly tell you about the history of this country from ancient times. Make yourself comfortable, we will begin. The history of Spain dates back to the Phoenicians, who founded colonies on the southern coast of the Iberian Peninsula around 1000 B.C. They founded cities such as Cartagena, Cordoba, and Cadiz, which have retained their grandeur and ancient history to this day. There was active trade across the Mediterranean and the Straits of Gibraltar, and Hannibal, after the First Punic War, extended the Carthaginian possessions to the east of the peninsula. However, only 20 years later, at the end of the Second Punic War and Paradox, Hannibal's control of the Pyrenees began to fall into Roman hands. It was not until the beginning of our era that Spain was finally under Roman control, and in a short time it became the second most important region of the Roman Empire after the Apennine Peninsula itself. By the way, 3 of the 5 good emperors of Rome came from Spain: Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. For this reason, and because of some of the following events, modern Spain in many ways looks more like the heir of the Roman Empire than Italy. For even after the brief reign of the Goths, there was Byzantine Spain in addition to Roman Spain. At that time, the southern part of Iberia was controlled by the surviving part of the Roman Empire, which had been invaded by the rebellious nobles of the Atanic Guild, who had rebelled against Agila. The Byzantines were able to maintain a foothold in southern Spain for 50 years, largely due to the fact that there were still Roman orders in those lands and the inhabitants were hostile to the Goths. Strong trade relations with Constantinople also played an important role. At the beginning of the 7th century, the Vestal Goths drove the Byzantines from the peninsula, and once again the Spanish lands became peaceful, but not for long. In 711, with the docking of the Arab detachment led by Tariq and Benziyad at the Cape of Gibraltar, began the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula by Muslims, Moors, which marked the beginning of the Muslim conquest of Spain, which subsequently led to one of the longest periods in the history of Spain, the Reconquista, which became one of the most complex and lengthy campaigns to fight for freedom and independence. We will talk about it in detail in a separate video, and here we will go through it briefly. The Arabs quickly managed to conquer all of the Visigoth lands, except for a small strip of land in the north of the peninsula, Asturias, which would become the base and starting point of the Reconquista for the next few centuries. The Moors attempted to push further into Europe, but were only able to ravage the French provinces adjacent to the Pyrenees, where they were destroyed by Charles Martel's army at Poitiers in 732. The rise of Christian Spain occurred in the 11th century, thanks to Kings Alfonso V, Sancho III, and Ferdinand I. They made different but incredibly important contributions to the formation of a unified and free Spanish state, from enacting laws to forcing the Moors to pay tribute. Although after that, at the turn of the 12th century and happened so-called rollback Reconquista, 100 years later, which by the standards of history, a fall in the sea progressed the decisive battle of the Spanish struggle for independence from the Arabs. On July 16, 1212, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa took place in the valley of Tolosa. The army, composed mainly of troops from the states of the Iberian Peninsula, along with crusaders, knights of various orders, and Christians from different countries, defeated the Moorish army. Over the next 20 years, Spain was almost completely liberated from Arab rule, and the last Moorish state, the Emirate of Granada, finally ceased to exist in 1492. This marked the end of the Reconquista. An important event at the end of the Reconquista was the unification of the great kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula into a single Spanish kingdom. This occurred in 1469 with the marriage of Isabella I, Queen of Castile and Leon, and Ferdinand II, King of Castile, Aragon, Sicily, and Naples. Simultaneously with the end of the Reconquista, the era of the Spanish conquest of America began. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, after receiving funding, organized an expedition to India, but instead discovered the Caribbean islands, South America, and North America. Although Columbus thought he had discovered India rather than a new continent, this did not stop Spanish expansion. The colonization of the Americas was called the Conquista, Its direct participants were conquistadors, most of whom were knights who completed the conquista. An important factor in the influx of conquistadors was the fact that, being outside of Europe, the Spaniards were free from the royal and ecclesiastical authority of the Spanish crown. Enterprising Spaniards traveled to the New World in search of the untold riches of its native owners. Spanish conquistadors, though outnumbered, defeated the Aztec, Inca, and Mayan peoples. The most famous leaders of the conquest were Hernán Cortés, Hernández de Córdoba, and Francisco de Montilla. The Conquista era began the Golden Age of Spain, during which the Spanish crown became the strongest political power in Europe. This did not last long, however. As a result of dynastic marriages, the Spanish monarch became Charles V of the Habsburg family, who became Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. He left the Spanish lands, although he remained King of Spain. This caused widespread discontent among the Spaniards, which led, among other things, to the revolt of the Castilian cities, known in history as the possible Comuneros. Their demands were that the king rule Spain directly, replace foreign officials in leading positions with Spanish ones, weaken absolutism, and convene the Cortes regularly. The Cortes were the Portuguese and Spanish parliaments. The rebellion was suppressed, but soon after, Charles issued a decree of total amnesty while significantly reducing the privileges of the nobility. The Cortes also granted Charles unconditional funds for the war with France. Nevertheless, even this did not prevent Spain from reaching its heyday into the 16th century, largely due to the colony. For a short period of time, Spain even managed to conquer Portugal and took over more Portuguese overseas territories. Among the reasons for the decline of Spain, which already began at the end of the 16th century, we can distinguish several key ones. The first was the stratification of society into those who had access to the wealth brought from the colony and those who did not. Spain was repeating the fate of the Roman Empire, when one part of the population literally had nothing to eat and the other part feasted endlessly. The second reason was the reckless spending of the gold that was pouring into the treasury from the New World. The Spanish crown spent it to support Habsburg rule in Europe and to help the Catholic Church establish its dominance. The economy of the country did not benefit. Investments, trade and crafts in the place declined, and therefore the trading cities continued to play an important political role. But they did not strengthen their position as trade and craft centers. Another important reason was national. After the Reconquista, Muslims who had converted to Christianity and remained in Spain continued to work hard. However, the state viewed them as an unreliable class of society, which often resulted in confiscation of property, increased taxes, and various forms of oppression. Such people were called Morisci, which means little Moor, and the trading posts of most markets tended to be owned by the Moors. So the Spanish crown was shooting itself in the foot with their disadvantage. With the economic decline, Spain began to lose political weight in the international arena, and attempts to intervene in the religious affairs of other countries and at all turned out to be a complete failure. The defeat did not spare the pride of Spain, its navy. The invincible Armada was defeated in 1588 by the English fleet, among which none other than pirates stood out. Formally, they were not pirates, as they bore the proud title of privateers, but the plundering continued, not only touching the ships of the English crown and its allies. The 17th century brought nothing but defeats for the Spanish monarchy. At the beginning of the century, Spain, the richest country in Europe, went bankrupt. To compensate, there was another mass confiscation of Moorish property, followed by their expulsion from Spain, but even that did not help the treasury. The once vibrant trading cities fell into disrepair. In the 40s, Portugal seceded separately from Spain. Catalonia rebelled and became de facto independent for 12 years, and the Netherlands gained independence from the Spanish crown. Although the monarchy managed to save the country from complete disintegration at the cost of abandoning Portugal, there was no talk of any former ambitions. In 1700, the last representative of the Habsburg dynasty on the Spanish throne, Carlos II, died. In the absence of his heirs, the country plunged into a 14-year war for the Spanish succession, which was won by France, which placed Philip V Bourbon on the Spanish throne. With the first Bourbons on the Spanish throne began and positive changes in various aspects of life. In the country, the role of the church was weakened, the state apparatus was renewed, and trade flourished again. But even this did not last long. At the end of the 18th century, Spain fell back into recession, and in the early 19th century the country and all concluded an alliance with Napoleon's France. However, the population decided not to tolerate another war for someone else's interests. From 1808 to 1813 the Civil War began. To prevent the victory of the French, in addition to the freedom-loving Spaniards, helped and the Russians, who defeated the army of Bonaparte, the French were forced to withdraw from the Iberian Peninsula. The next 100 years were again spent in civil wars with constant changes of power and uncertainty. In the political arena of the country, it was not until 1875 that stability returned. The government led by Cánovas del Castillo implemented a plan for a peaceful transition that would create a two-party system in Spain, with the liberal conservative and liberal parties alternating power without allowing political differences that could lead to another civil war. In fact, this plan implied that elections would be rigged and that no other political force could come to power. However, until the early 20th century, this plan helped keep Spain out of major internal strife and ensured the stability of the political system. Spain began to develop again, industry and trade grew. Pereira became a popular tourist destination, and various reforms were enacted, the most important of which was the judicial reform. But, as they say, history is cyclical, and Spain, once again briefly in a state of tranquility, plunged into decline. Defeats in the Spanish-American War, internal rebellions, and the crisis that followed World War I all had a negative impact on Spain. A series of these events led to a full-scale civil war in the mid-30s, the outcome of which determined the face and life of the country, over which a cloudless sky stretched for the next few decades. Share your opinion on the fate of Spain in the comments. What do you think is the most significant period in its history? We are looking forward to your answers. And that's it for today. See you again, friends.